så mycket för inbjudan. Så fint att få vara här. Jag träffade några av studenterna igår och då sa de att det är kanske bättre att tala engelska än svenska. Så jag har gått på det rådet, så den powerpointen är på danska. And then the rest will be in English. But feel free to make comments or ask questions in Danish. I usually understand Danish, so I think we can mix languages here. Really good to be here at MF and to meet some old friends. That's great, and it's of course very encouraging for me to see my book being translated into Danish. And the subject today and what I will be talking about is of course the same subject as that of the book. I work for Apologia, Center for Christian Apologetics. We're based in Stockholm. And we work basically with two things: to train Christians in apologetics, to explain and defend the Christian faith, and we do evangelism from an apologetic perspective, a reasoned presentation of the gospel. We do quite a lot of work on the internet, so if you want to see what we're doing and you like to improve your Swedish, you can go into apologia.se. We live in a very strange time where our culture is undergoing rapid change and really revolutionary changes. It can be illustrated in many ways. On International Women's Day, the 8th of March this year, Annelise Dodds, who is Labour's shadow minister for women and equalities, so she is politically working for women's rights, and she was asked, "What is a woman?" And she refused to answer. She went on and on and on, and the most thing she could say was, "I think it does depend what the context is." So she's fighting for women's rights, but she refuses to define what is a woman. J.K. Rowling, the author of Harry Potter, she responded on Twitter, "Someone please send the shadow minister for equalities a dictionary and a backbone." So she's Rowling is highly critical toward what's going on in our society, where we cannot even today define what is a man and what is a woman. I recently saw this on the official website of the Swedish courts. It's about parenthood, and you see the title here, "You have given birth to a child." And the text says first about, if you are a woman who gives birth to a child, it's called something in Swedish. If you are a man and give birth to a child, okay. This is in the official legal texts. If you are a man and you give birth to a child. Really strange. In Läkartidningen, the official magazine for doctors or academic journal for doctors, they had this article about a drastic increase of gender dysphoria among young people during the last decade, there is an increase in 2,300% in young people experiencing gender dysphoria. Suddenly, it just explodes among young people, this feeling of being born into the wrong body. And they are discussing what's the cause of this. And we all have been forced to learn a lot of new words and new letters and the meaning of those letters. HBTQIA+ in Swedish, LGBTQEI, and more, for new identities and new sexual identities. All what is going on in the culture, of course, creeps into the church. In the official magazine of the Swedish Lutheran Church, there was an interview with a queer theologian studying queer theology, working on her doctorate. And she is now arguing for the church, that the church must accept polyamory, that you have several different sexual relationships going on simultaneously. And she talks about, well, some people are created like that by God. And there is no other way of knowing God's will than just listen to your own inner being, your inner voice. What other way would there be to know the will of God than listening to your heart, is her reasoning. If one just goes back 30, 40, 50 years in time, this would be totally unthinkable. This would be themes for comedy and laughter. And now it's really intense discussion in our culture. We have undergone a really dramatic change in our understanding of what it is to be a human being, what it is to be a bodily, physical being, what it is to be a sexual being, what it is to be a man or a woman. How has this happened? I think it's important for us to try to not only discuss the specific issues, we need to do that, and there will be time in the last session to discuss a lot of those, but we need to try to understand, why has this happened? Why suddenly is our culture changing the understanding of all those issues? So this first presentation will be on the historical roots of what's going on today. What's the historical roots? I think it's important for us to understand that what's happening in contemporary culture is not random. It is connected to ideas. It's connected to ideas in history. There are roots for what's going on, and we need to try to uncover some of those roots. So let's see what we can do in 30 minutes. There's something called World Value Survey, which analyzes different cultures from two different perspectives. They have two axes from which they evaluate cultures. One is to look where on the line of traditional values versus what they call secular rational values. Traditional values are religious values, and then you have the secular rational values. And the other axis is survival values versus self-expression values. Culture who are focusing on just surviving physically, so the poor cultures. And those cultures where you basically have solved the issue of how to survive, have food and shelter and so on, and you can start to focus on how to express yourself. And this is the map for 2020 of the world's different cultures and countries. So if you're down here, it's traditional, and up there, secular rational values. And this is survival values versus self-expression values. And you see Protestant Europe is highest up on secular and self-expression. And in Protestant Europe, it's the Scandinavian countries up there, and further up there, it's, of course, Sweden. So, we are the most secular and the most individualistic cultures, the Scandinavian cultures. We're secular, and we're focusing on self-expression. Let's look into those two terms. We are secular, and we have our focus on self-expression. What does secular mean? We use it often. We talk about secularization, we talk about the secular culture. What does it mean? The word secular comes from a Latin word, seculum, which we in Swedish have in the word sekel. You have that in Danish? Okay. So it's about time. The secular is when you focus on this time, not the coming time, not eternity. You're focusing on this world, which you can access now with your senses, not the spiritual, supernatural world. So you're focusing on here and now. Other aspects, God, eternity, is irrelevant or not real. So we have become secular cultures that focusing on here and now. This is, of course, a shocking change of our countries. If we travel in Europe, if we travel in the Scandinavian countries, everywhere we see those majestic cathedrals with a tower pointing to heaven. There is a God who has created everything. There is something beyond this world that is more foundational than this world. And on the top of that tower there is a cross. That this God who has created this world, he has come down to us in the historical person of Jesus. And this perspective, the Christian perspective, has marked so many aspects of Western culture and also the Scandinavian cultures. But what has happened is that we have divorced God. That is what has happened in our culture. We have divorced God and Christianity and the church. And we have become secular. We don't point towards heaven any longer. We point down here. Or to change metaphor, we have changed tracks. So we are now on a track where this world is the only important thing. How did that happen? I think it's really important to look into that. We will not do that today, but I really encourage you to look into why have Europe become secular when we have those deep roots in Christianity. How did that happen? Of course, it's a complex story, but an important part of that story is, of course, that people, or the intellectual elite, started to raise questions, objections against the Christian faith, saying, intellectually, can we really believe in God? Is that the coherent concept of a creator God? Scientifically, is it really possible to take Christianity seriously? Don't we have better answer from science than we have from religion? Historically, so many of the stories in the Bible are not true, they claim. They have no historical basis. They have not actually happened. They are myths or legends or things written down a long time after, where they have just added a lot of stuff. into the text, so historically we cannot rely on it. Morally, the Christian faith is limited human experience, human life. And if you look carefully, God himself is an immoral being. If you study the Old Testament especially, God is not moral, and the Christian ethic is not a morally good ethic. And institutionally, the church has been an institution of power and of suppression, and has not made a good contribution. So, from a number of perspectives, the Christian faith was criticized intellectually, and it was given a too weak response from the churches. And what happened during the French Revolution, the secular Enlightenment, was that this critique kind of won the debate. So gradually, this perspective that it is not possible to take Christianity really serious any longer, that became gradually more and more accepted. So in the end, our culture divorced Christianity. Of course, that took a long time. It started with the intellectual elite, and then you can say from after the Second World War, it took over gradually the whole culture, the whole population. I would say mainly through the educational system, this new perspective on how to understand life was implemented into the population. Now, if you kick away God and say, no God, you don't have nothing. You have to put something in the place of God. And, of course, what we have done is that we have become humanists. This is the symbol of the International Humanist Organization. It's called Happy Human, and you see it's someone raising their hands as worshipping, but there's no one to worship. It's someone who is released. Finally, there is no God suppressing me. I'm free. Notice it's one person. It's an individual, finally free. And of course, there's been great hope that now, when we get rid of Christianity, we will really be free and happy. And here starts this search for self-expression. So that was the other typical thing of our culture. We are secular and we are focusing on self-expression. And we can afford that because we have solved the basic material issues. We have food and shelter. Hopefully we have some warmth this winter, we have to see. But, since there is no God, we can focus on ourselves. The inner self has been elevated to be the ultimate authority. It follows from secularism. It's the basic credo of humanism. Man is the measure of all things. Man is the norm. There is nothing above the individual human. What could there be? There is no God. So I can take as an individual the place of God. Man, meaning the individual human being, is the measure of all things. This is a really big change. If you think historically, people have thought there is a God. I am created and defined by God. I'm called by God. And I should understand my whole existence in the light of who God is and his definition of life and his calling to me and what he has said in his word. So you have something external to yourself that defines you and the whole existence. Now it's our inner self that has become the ultimate. And now we see our whole culture on a desperate hunt for understanding. Then who am I? What from the beginning could feel like a wonderful liberation. Whoa, there's no God, I'm free. And then gradually it dawns upon you. And then who am I? I'm nothing. I need to create myself. I have no definition. So I have to go into myself to try to find something, or look at something external to mirror myself into and see, could that be me? Or could that be me? And if you follow people on Instagram, isn't that what people are doing? Testing different identities to see, is this me? If you put yourself as the ultimate norm, that of course will change how you think about right and wrong. All cultures make this differentiation between right and wrong, but you can come to that whole moral, ethical issue from a slightly different perspective. In the Christian West, guilt and innocence was guilt or righteousness was the kind of basic concept inspired from how the Bible views it. Other cultures have mere come to it from a honoring or shame perspective, or purity and impurity, power and weakness. What has happened now is that the key ethical perspective is pleasure and pain. Pleasure is the good thing, pain is the evil thing. So we have really shifted our understanding in how we think morally. An American sociologist, Philip Reef, he says this: religious man was born to be saved. You're thinking of religious man that was before the Enlightenment, before we become secular. Religious man was born to be saved. Realized I need something external to myself to save me, to help me, to define me. Religious man was born to be saved. Psychological man, that is his word for a culture of self-expression. Psychological man is born to be pleased. That captures a lot of our culture, I think. Religious man was born to be saved. Psychological man is born to be pleased. So we're not thinking in the traditional terms of right and wrong, good and evil. We are thinking so much in terms of what is pleasing to me as an individual. And added to this mixture, if you start with yourself, and the individual is the foundation, sexuality is such an important part of the individual. And here it's hard to not refer to Sigmund Freud. In his book Civilization and its Discontents, he says this: man's discovery that sexual, genital love afforded him the strongest experiences of satisfaction, and in fact provided him with a prototype of all happiness, must have suggested to him that he should continue to seek the satisfaction of happiness in his life along the path of sexual relations, and that he should make genital eroticism the central point of his life. Of course, this is not true of everyone, that everyone is making genital eroticism or sex the central point of his or her life. Most well-functioning human beings realize that there are other aspects of human existence that's important for fulfillment. But still, there's something here in this quote from Freud that is relevant for our culture. We are putting an enormous emphasis on sexual gratification. That sexual genital love is a kind of high road to satisfaction, and not being able to express oneself sexually is seen as a huge tragedy. In a way, it was not in previous times. What I've tried to describe for you has created what can be called the perfect storm for our culture. The perfect storm is this expression where you have several factors, independent factors, who come together and makes the storm so much stronger. The perfect storm for our culture is, we say there is no God, we have become secular. There's no God, the universe is the only thing that there is. And we are the highest being in the universe. Therefore, myself can be at the center of the universe. And when I look into myself, sexuality is at the center of my own self. So, when I see those different, strange things going on in our culture, there's what I started this presentation, that we cannot define a woman any longer. We think that men can give birth to children. That we are not sure we are born into the right body any longer. I think all those and many, many other aspects have their roots in this deep change of our culture, a change in understanding reality itself. And that has opened the door for this radical new perspective on life, this radical new anthropology view of the human being. In the next session, I will try to show you how this specifically has happened with what we call the sexual revolution. And I end with this picture. It's a famous painting, Liberty Leading the People. This is a painting illustrating the French Revolution, the secular revolution, and the almost naked woman there is a symbol for freedom. Freedom from oppression, freedom from God, freedom from church. But I think it's a good representation also with this almost naked woman, because the sexual revolution has its root in the French Revolution, in the Enlightenment Revolution, in the dethronement of God. It started all there, and now we are reaping the fruits of that dethronement of God. We are reaping the fruit as a culture. It took a long time before it became an everyday reality, this kind of mass phenomenon we see today. But that's the way it is with ideas. Ideas often take a long time to really be rooted in a culture and start to produce fruits. It was the same with the Christian ideas. Our culture was not changed immediately by the gospel being preached. People's lives were changed, but the whole mindset of how to think about slaves and free people, male and female, to think about economics or think about science, it took a long, long time before the Christian ideas started to be rooted and have consequences, good fruits in our culture. And in the same way, the destructive ideas of the Enlightenment, that there is no God and that the human self is at the center, it took time before they were really rooted in our culture and started to bear fruits. But today, I think we can see a lot of those fruits. Okay, I think I end here, and we have a few minutes if there are questions or comments or objections. So, feel free to. Yes?
Yes. I have a question regarding the move I think we're seeing from humanism to, some call it anti-humanism, but the self is not always the center of people's worldviews anymore. I think at least some people are rejecting the term humanism because it is racism, speciesism is the word, against other species. So I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that and how that may play into this topic about sexuality.
Yeah, thank you. So our culture is not a monolithic culture where everyone thinks exactly the same. We are, of course, a pluralistic culture, so we are a number of Christians still here, even though we are a minority. We have an influence of Islam that we have not had before, so they have their own thinking, and we have people who are different versions of maybe pantheists, or if they're some people in the green movement, they do not want to have one biological life form above the rest. So of course we have all different kinds of, there's a plurality in our society, and yet there is one perspective that is dominating, that is the cultural norm, which dominates education, dominates media, and the majority of people are moving in that direction, and that is secular humanism. Even if people don't use those two words to describe themselves, their thinking still is, if you categorize it, it's secular humanism. And at least I'm not, of course, not an expert on Denmark, but I would claim to be an expert on Sweden, since I come from there. And in Sweden, secular humanism is the totally dominating paradigm in public discourse and in all forms of education. And then you have those dissenting voices in the fringe, people who have another perspective. And that means for us, it's really important to listen to individuals we have dialogues with or relationships with, so we don't just assume that they are like the majority. We need to take every individual serious. So I think it's helpful to understand the big picture, the majority, in what direction is our culture moving, and then that needs to be combined with a seriousness in interacting with an individual who can have often their mix of beliefs and perspectives, because that's another typical thing of our culture, that people are not coherent. They don't have a really well thought out framework, because we are individualists and we move according to our inner feeling, and we take one idea there or one thought there as long as it feels good. And then people don't have this introspection to see, my different beliefs, do they really cohere? Do they make sense together? So that's very typical, as I see, that people hold incoherent views, and they do not realize that they are incoherent.
more to the importance of broadening your horizon. I think if I were to sit down with one of my non-Christian friends and talk about this issue of homosexuality, they would say, but why should I look into how our society was born and the history with the French Revolution or how these ideas come? Why not just focus on this society today, the people living in our culture? So I think you did quite a lot to broaden the horizon, and it sheds some light on the issue. But could you talk a little bit more to the importance of that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. That's a good input. So if I talk to people who want to discuss sexuality or question a Christian view on homosexuality, for example, I usually don't give them a lecture on the French Revolution and the Enlightenment because it's not helpful. It would just be viewed very arrogant. I can see that. So I gave you this in order for us to have a broader view, to try to understand why is this happening. It's not just out of the blue. It's possible to, at least to some degree, understand why our culture is going through this. In a conversation, I would focus on the more direct issue of, is there a design to human life? Because that's an issue where a Christian worldview and secular humanism are crashing into each other. As Christians, we are convinced that there is design behind this universe, behind us as human beings. So we think there is a thought behind the fact that we are bodily, that we are sexual, that we have that our sexuality and our ability to multiply is made in a certain way. We think there is a design behind that, namely the mind of God, and we want to follow that. And then I totally understand if there is no God, then there is no design. So there's where the two worldviews crash into each other. The problem here is that so many non-Christians, they, in some issues, would just ignore the concept of design. So, for example, it's almost forbidden today to say anything about our bodies and say, what are our bodies signaling? And I would say there are heterosexual signals from our bodies. Because it's a man's and a woman's body who fit together sexually. Two women cannot be bodily united. Two men cannot, in a for the body natural way, being united. So there's a difference. In terms of biology, it's only the heterosexual relationship that can give birth to new human beings. So hetero and homo is not identical. They are not alike. There are serious differences. Now, I'm not allowed to say that in most cases because it's so sensitive. At the same time, people would argue in a similar way. For example, in terms of incest, very few people questions the taboo against incest. So then people would argue for what is biologically natural. It's not to have those really close sexual relationships within a family, even if it's grown up, so it's not a parent and a child, but if it's a grown-up child and a parent, you shouldn't do that because biologically it's not good. It does not work according to the bodies. We know there are, if a child is conceived, there is a high risk of problems. So in one area, people freely argue from reality, bodies, biology. In another area, we are told we need to just ignore it. So, long answer for your question. I will focus on the whole issue, is there a design? Okay,